Welcome to Log Finance, the podcast where we delve into the financial decisions shaping our world. Today, we're diving into a topic that's dominating headlines globally: rising government debt and the looming risk of a fiscal crunch, with politicians like Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, and Emmanuel Macron facing skyrocketing deficits. The big question is, how can they steer their countries away from a debt crisis without stifling growth or triggering inflation? Let's break it down. The problem with big government spending: governments worldwide are grappling with ballooning deficits. Take the United States, for example. America's national debt now stands at a staggering $36,107,000 per person, and it's growing fast. Trump's plans for sweeping tax cuts will likely add 4.1 trillion to the debt over the next decade. Across the Atlantic, the Eurozone isn't faring much better, with countries like France, Italy, and Poland posting deficits well above 5% of GDP. And let's not forget emerging economies like China and India, where public debt is rising rapidly, creating long-term vulnerabilities. Why does this matter? Because unchecked government spending without proper revenue generation can trigger a cascade of problems. These include higher borrowing costs, reduced private sector investment, and rising inflation. In extreme cases, it can even lead to fiscal crises, as we saw with the UK's gilt market meltdown in 2022. Who to borrow from and what form debt should take. One of the most critical decisions for any government is figuring out who to borrow from and how to structure that debt. Borrowing from domestic investors may seem safer than relying on foreign creditors, but it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, governments can leverage tools like tax breaks or regulatory nudges to incentivize local investment. On the other hand, over-reliance on domestic investors can concentrate financial risk within the economy. If a fiscal crisis hits, domestic investors are often the first to jump ship. The type of debt also matters. Long-term borrowing spreads out the repayment burden and shields governments from short-term market volatility, but it comes at a higher cost. Conversely, short-term debt can be cheaper upfront, but poses refinancing risks if market sentiment turns sour. Then there's the question of currency. Countries like the US can issue debt in their own currency because global markets trust their central banks. However, emerging economies often resort to borrowing in foreign currencies, making them vulnerable to exchange rate fluctuations. A depreciating currency can quickly turn debt repayments into a financial nightmare. The trap of financial repression. When borrowing costs spiral out of control, some governments turn to financial repression, policies that force domestic institutions like banks to buy government debt. While this can temporarily suppress interest rates, it often comes at the expense of private sector credit and long-term economic growth. Turkey is a case in point. Its use of financial repression to lower borrowing costs backfired spectacularly, fueling inflation and drying up private lending. Even wealthier nations aren't immune to these tactics. After World War II, countries like the US and UK used similar measures to manage debt, and modern regulatory frameworks, such as requirements for banks to hold government bonds, echo these strategies. However, with inflation now a top concern for voters, governments have far less room to maneuver without facing political backlash. How to avoid a debt crisis. So, what can leaders like Trump, Starmer, and Macron do to avoid a fiscal meltdown? Here are three key strategies. Balance spending with revenue. While cutting spending or raising taxes may be politically unpalatable, fiscal discipline is essential. Leaders must focus on targeted, high impact investments in areas like infrastructure and innovation while avoiding wasteful or poorly managed programs. Lengthen debt maturities. Issuing more long term debt can stabilize borrowing costs, even if it's more expensive in the short term. This reduces the risk of sudden refinancing crises during market downturns. Encourage growth. The best way to reduce debt to GDP ratios is to grow the economy. Pro-business policies that stimulate private investment, improve productivity, and expand the tax base can go a long way in alleviating fiscal pressures. The danger of populism. One of the biggest obstacles to sound fiscal policy is populism. Politicians often prioritize short-term popularity over long-term sustainability, offering tax cuts or increased spending without considering the financial consequences. This approach might win votes, but it often leads to unsustainable debt and economic instability. Take the example of Liz Truss's short-lived UK premiership. Her unfunded tax cuts triggered a bond market crisis that not only cost her the job, but also left a lasting mark on the country's financial credibility. Leaders today must learn from such mistakes and resist the temptation to prioritize populism over prudence. Final thoughts. In the end, managing national debt is about striking a delicate balance between growth, stability, and fiscal responsibility. Leaders who ignore these fundamentals risk plunging their countries into economic turmoil. For Trump, Starmer, Macron, and their counterparts worldwide, the stakes couldn't be higher. Thank you for tuning in to Log Finance. If you found this discussion insightful, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts. Let's keep the conversation going about how we can build a more sustainable and prosperous economic future. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking the tough questions.